Nearly 300 feet beneath the Adriatic, divers found wreckage that was still unmistakably aircraft. Propellers, engine cowlings, sections of wing. The machine had been underwater for almost 80 years, yet major parts of its shape could still be recognized. It was a consolidated B-24 Liberator, one of the American heavy bombers that crossed this sea during the Second World War. And it was not alone. During a 2-week expedition off Croatia in August of 2022, a team working with Project Recover, the Defense POW MIA accounting agency, and Croatian specialists located or relocated 5 B-24 wreck sites. 3 were positively identified. Those 3 aircraft were associated with 23 American servicemen who were still unaccounted for. That sounded like the end of a mystery. In reality, it was only the point where another one became more precise. Finding a 4-engine bomber on the bottom of the Adriatic was one problem. Proving exactly which bomber it was and deciding what that discovery meant for the missing men connected to it was much harder. To understand why American B-24s ended up beneath Croatian waters, the story has to move back to the final years of the war in Europe. American heavy bombers, operating from bases in Italy, flew missions against targets across German-controlled Europe. For damaged aircraft, the return journey could be as difficult as the mission itself. Some bombers could no longer complete the crossing back to Italy. In those cases, crews sometimes followed the Yugoslav coast toward areas where Allied control offered another chance to survive, and some aircraft ended up ditching or crashing in the Adriatic. The public record does not show that the 5 B-24s found in 2022 all followed the same sequence. It does not show that everyone was shot down, or that all 5 were returning from the same target. What it does show is a region where American aircraft were lost in significant numbers, sometimes close enough to the coast that fragments of their stories survive through wartime reports, local knowledge, and later diving. The wider area is believed to contain roughly 30 American aircraft wrecks. That number changes the nature of the search. Investigators were not looking for one isolated airplane in otherwise empty water. They were working inside a landscape of wartime losses, uncertain positions, previously reported wrecks, and aircraft that might be known locally without ever having been formally identified. So the first search did not begin with sonar. It began with records. Researchers examined military documents, aircraft loss information, and case material connected to the Defense POW MIA accounting agency. They compared those records with knowledge gathered from Croatian fishermen, divers, and local specialists. One source might describe where an aircraft was last seen. Another might place a loss near a particular section of coast. A local diver might know of engines or wing structure on the seabed without knowing which aircraft they belonged to. The task was to turn fragments of history into areas small enough to search. That distinction matters because the 5 sites were described as located or relocated. The wording is careful. It does not claim that every wreck had been completely unknown since the war. Some may already have been known to people in the area. The goal of the expedition was more demanding than simply proving that wreckage existed. The team wanted to document the sites and, where the evidence allowed it, connect them to specific missing aircraft. Old loss records rarely provide the kind of position that allows a modern team to send a diver directly to the right wreck. A wartime location could be approximate, and an aircraft might travel some distance after its last report. The point written in a file was not necessarily the point where the bomber finally came to rest. So researchers built broader search zones where documentary evidence and local knowledge overlapped. A wartime record could point toward a general area. Local knowledge could suggest that something had actually been seen there. That is why the word relocated matters as much as located. A wreck can be known physically and still remain historically unresolved. Fishermen can know that metal lies on the bottom. Divers can recognize engines or a wing. Yet, until the site is documented and compared with the right records, the aircraft can remain little more than an anonymous machine beneath the sea. For this expedition, the researchers were trying to close that gap. They were not simply searching for wreckage. They were trying to turn a position on the seabed into evidence that could be connected to a wartime loss. Then the search moved from paper to the Adriatic. In August of 2022, Project Recover, the Defense POW MIA accounting agency, and Croatian partners began a roughly 2-week expedition over the search area. One of their most important tools was an autonomous underwater vehicle, or AUV, a small, unmanned machine that could follow programmed routes below the surface without being physically tethered to the vessel above. For this mission, Project Recover integrated 3 systems on one vehicle. Side-scan sonar could reveal the shapes and shadows of objects on the bottom. A magnetometer could help detect ferrous material, even when it was difficult to distinguish visually. A high-resolution camera could inspect promising targets. The 2022 mission also marked the first time Project Recover had combined the side-scan sonar, magnetometer, and high-resolution camera on a single AUV for one of its expeditions. That mattered because each system answered a different part of the same practical question. Sonar could show that an unusual shape was present. Magnetic data could add another reason to investigate. Camera imagery could help the team judge whether a target deserved closer attention. But none of those systems removed the need for interpretation. The vehicle could repeatedly cross the bottom and return more data than divers could ever gather by swimming search patterns at that depth. It allowed the team to spend human dive time on the targets that had already survived an initial screening. The AUV did not roam randomly. It followed long, parallel tracks across the seabed, a pattern the team described as mowing the lawn. Line after line, it crossed the search area and built a record of what lay below. By the end of the expedition, approximately 24 square miles of seafloor had been surveyed. That scale matters. A sonar return is not automatically an aircraft. The AUV could narrow the search from many square miles to a set of specific anomalies. But a screen image alone could not tell investigators that they had found a particular B-24 with a particular crew. The machine could point to a target. People still had to determine what it was. The wreck sites lay at roughly 300 feet, close to 90 meters deep. That depth made the logic of the operation clear. The AUV could cover a large search area efficiently. Divers could then be sent to selected targets, where direct inspection was worth the effort. At roughly 300 feet, that selectivity mattered. The depth was described by the expedition team as being near the practical safety limit for the divers involved. The sources do not provide the details of individual dive profiles, and none are needed to understand the problem. The deeper point is simpler. Every descent had to be directed towards something worth examining. So the underwater work followed the logic established above the surface. First, narrow the region with records. Then, narrow the seabed with the AUV. Only then send divers to the strongest targets. That sequence is what allowed a search covering 24 square miles to become a series of individual aircraft investigations. On the seabed, the abstract shapes seen in sonar data became recognizable aircraft wreckage. Propellers remained visible. Engine cowlings could still be identified. Sections of wing structure survived in forms that made their origin clear. The aircraft were not intact, and the sources do not describe them as complete. But enough major components remained for divers and archaeologists to recognize B-24 wreckage after nearly 8 decades underwater. One site was confirmed, then another, and the count kept rising. By the end of the expedition, the team had located or relocated 5 B-24 wreck sites. For Project Recover, it was the largest underwater aviation discovery the organization had made to that point. But finding more aircraft also created a more complicated identification problem. Knowing that a wreck was a B-24 was not the same as knowing which B-24 it was. Several Liberators had been lost in the region. Many shared the same basic structure and components. A recognizable propeller or wing section could establish aircraft type without establishing individual identity. The next stage, therefore, depended on details. Divers and archaeologists documented the wreck sites and compared what they found with historical loss records. Wreckage pieces recovered by technical diver Andy Marovic contributed to the identification of 2 of the aircraft. The public sources do not reveal exactly what those pieces were. They do not give the serial numbers involved, the markings that may have been examined, or the full chain of reasoning used to match each wreck to a particular wartime loss. That gap should not be filled with guesswork. What is known is that physical evidence from the sites was compared with historical documentation, and that the process ultimately produced 3 positive aircraft identifications. 3 of the 5 B-24s were no longer anonymous wrecks inside the investigation. The 3 positive identifications also changed what could be done with the historical record. Before identification, a site could be described as a B-24 wreck in a region containing several possible losses. After identification, the wreck could be placed inside one specific unresolved case file. That transformation did not require the aircraft to be raised. It required enough agreement between the physical site and the documentary record for investigators to say that the wreck belonged to one loss rather than another. That restraint is part of the case itself. The expedition produced more certainty than it could immediately publish. At first, that seems like the point where the mystery should disappear completely. 3 aircraft had been identified. It would seem natural to publish 3 serial numbers, 3 unit histories, and 3 crew lists. But that did not happen. The reason is that the wrecks were connected to something more serious than aircraft history. Across the 3 identified B-24s, 23 American servicemen remained unaccounted for. That number has to be understood carefully. It does not mean 23 bodies were found. It does not mean remains were recovered during the 2022 expedition. It does not prove that all 23 men were physically located at the wreck sites. It means the 3 identified aircraft were associated with 23 unresolved personnel cases. That changed the meaning of the discovery. For an aviation historian, identifying a wreck can be the end of the central question. For the Defense POW MIA accounting agency, identifying the aircraft may only establish where a new phase of investigation could begin. The agency's purpose is not simply to name lost machines. It is to account for missing people. That is why the public announcement carried an unusual combination of precision and restraint. 5 B-24 sites had been located or relocated. 3 aircraft had been positively identified. 23 still missing servicemen were associated with those 3 aircraft. But the individual aircraft identities were not released publicly. Project Recover works with open personnel accounting cases under restrictions that prevent case details from being treated like ordinary historical discoveries. Until the formal process has progressed far enough and families have been properly notified, information that could reveal an unresolved identity is handled carefully. So the expedition could announce a major success without publishing the names behind it. The wrecks had been identified inside the investigation, but the public story remained deliberately incomplete. For anyone expecting a traditional aircraft recovery story, the next surprise is what did not happen. There was no attempt to raise a complete B-24. No crane began lifting a fuselage from the Adriatic. No wing was hauled to the surface for restoration. No bomber from the 5 sites was transferred to a museum. The 2022 expedition was not a full aircraft salvage operation. The significant physical recovery described publicly involved smaller wreckage pieces used in the identification process. The aircraft themselves remained on the seabed. That was not evidence that the expedition had failed. It reflected what the expedition had actually been designed to do. Project Recover's role was to help locate, document, and identify sites connected to missing American servicemen. Whether a later mission should search for and attempt to recover human remains is a decision for the Defense POW MIA accounting agency. Finding an aircraft and salvaging an aircraft are different objectives. So one of the largest underwater aviation discoveries in Project Recover's history ended without the image that normally concludes a salvage documentary. There were no lifting cables tightening around a bomber, no fuselage breaking the surface, no restoration hangar waiting on shore. Instead, the operation ended with better information. Wartime records that had pointed only toward possible loss areas could now be connected to real wreck sites. Sonar targets had become documented aircraft. 3 of those aircraft had been positively identified, and investigators now had specific locations that could be evaluated in relation to unresolved personnel cases. That is what the expedition actually changed. Before the survey, researchers had historical records, local reports, and missing aircraft cases spread across a broad region. After the survey, they had 5 B-24 wreck sites and 3 positive identifications. The route from one state to the other required several kinds of evidence working together. Historical documents narrowed the search area. Local knowledge helped refine where the team should look. The AUV surveyed large sections of seabed with sonar, a magnetometer, and a camera. Divers inspected selected targets directly. Archaeologists documented what they found. Recovered pieces from 2 sites contributed to identification, and historical comparison turned 3 wrecks from aircraft type into individual cases. No single technology solved the problem. Project Recover was also developing machine learning tools to speed the review of sonar imagery, but that work supported the larger process rather than replacing it. The search still depended on archives, local knowledge, underwater survey, diving, archaeological recording, and historical comparison. That matters because the most important result of the expedition was not simply that advanced equipment could find metal underwater. The real achievement was the connection between evidence separated by almost 80 years. A wartime report recorded an aircraft that failed to return. Decades later, a search team narrowed the possible area. An AUV detected a target. Divers confirmed that the target was a bomber. Physical evidence was compared with historical records, and in 3 cases, an unnamed wreck became an identified aircraft. That is the point where the story changes from underwater discovery to personnel accounting. A B-24 wreck is visually dramatic. Its propellers and engines still suggest the scale of the machine that once flew above the Adriatic. But for the agency responsible for missing servicemen, the aircraft matters because of the people attached to its history. The 23 unresolved cases are therefore not an extra detail added after the discovery. They are the reason the discovery matters beyond aviation archaeology. And that is also why finding the aircraft did not complete the mission. Years after the expedition, the publicly available picture remained limited but clear. The 5 wreck sites were still underwater. 3 had been positively identified. The aircraft identities had not been publicly released in the original case reporting, and no approved source establishes that the 23 associated missing servicemen were recovered during the 2022 survey. The physical scene beneath the Adriatic therefore remains close to the one that opened the story. Propellers still lie on the seabed, engine cowlings and wing sections still mark the places where heavy bombers came down during the war. The 5 aircraft were no longer simply uncertain losses on paper. The wreck sites had been located, and 3 had been matched to specific aircraft inside the investigation. But discovery was not the same as resolution. That distinction is the central contradiction of the entire expedition. The technology was good enough to search 24 square miles of seafloor. Divers could descend to wrecks almost 300 feet below the surface. Archaeologists could connect physical evidence to wartime records. 3 aircraft could regain their identities, yet the human accounting connected to them remained unfinished. Most recovery stories end when the aircraft comes out of the water. This one ends with the aircraft staying where it is. The bombers were found, but the work that mattered most was not about bringing a machine home. It was about determining whether the wrecks could help answer what happened to men who had never been accounted for. Almost 8 decades after the war, 5 B-24 sites had been located beneath the Adriatic. 3 had been positively identified, and the 23 missing servicemen connected to those aircraft remained the reason the search was more than an exercise in finding old metal. The airplanes had been found. The accounting work was not finished. And as Mark Moline said after the expedition, there was still a lot more to be found.